Well, good morning, Benjamin Hadfield. Teach me to dive. We're interviewing today Dr. Stephen Kajiura, who's a distinguished professor with Florida Atlantic University. And Dr. Kajiura's groundbreaking research with sharks is amazing for sure. With 3 decades of experience studying just sharks and rays, Kajiura has contributed extensively to scientific literature, publications, and published numerous papers about shark research. He's also heavily involved in public outreach efforts for sure to help us understand more about sharks. Dr. Kajiura, thank you so much for coming in.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, let's just jump into it. How did you become interested in studying sharks?
You know, I was just always interested. For some reason, I was born in this rural farming community in southern Ontario, Canada, just far from any ocean. But I remember distinctly going to the library as a little kid and picking up all the shark books. And every Sunday afternoon, I'd watch Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins. And I'd watch like Jacques Cousteau specials. And I thought those were the greatest things ever. And so I was just always interested for no apparent reason. And I just was able to pursue it. I wanted to do it. And I, from age, birth, until now, I've just wanted to look at sharks, and I've managed to make a career out of it. So I consider myself really fortunate to do what I've always wanted to do.
Right on. So as a foremost shark expert, let's talk a little truth and myth about sharks for a moment. What is the most outlandish fake myth about sharks that you deal with on a regular basis?
One of the things that keeps popping up, even after several years, is this idea that people still think that the megalodon might still be out there somewhere. They think the ocean is huge, it's vast, we haven't explored it, but a tiny fraction of it. Surely there's a chance that there's a big, giant predatory shark out there, the megalodon that used to exist on this planet. And you know what? Sad to say, it's gone. I wish it were there. It would be so much fun to have a giant shark still roaming out there. But that one is not there. It's not to say that there's not other cool animals out there yet to be discovered. But in terms of megalodon, I'm afraid it's gone.
Jason Statham's not helping us on that one, is he? So what is the most outlandish truth that most people don't believe, but is really true about sharks?
Oh, let's think of what would be cool. One of the things that is really interesting is based on some work that one of my graduate students did several years ago. We looked at how well does sharks smell. Now, you've probably heard the myths that sharks can smell a drop of blood from a mile away and this sort of stuff, right? Well, that's just hyperbole. That is, outrageous. But what is true is these sharks can smell a single drop out of a billion drops or out of 10 billion drops. And so that is a tiny, tiny concentration, 1 part per billion or 1 part per 10 billion in some cases. And it seems hard to believe, but that is true. And for a variety of different sharks, the sense of smell is absolutely incredible.
So for context, one part for every 10 billion, what kind of distance are we looking at? Is that 300 yards, 400 yards?
So the way to think about this is maybe not so much distance, but volume.
Okay.
And so one of the things is if you put a single drop in like a fast moving current, it could transport that drop for quite a long distance, as opposed to dropping into like still water. It's just going to slowly diffuse over a certain distance. And so I'd rather talk about volume. And the way to think of it is if you look at a typical sort of, your backyard swimming pool. We're not talking a giant Olympic-sized pool or something, but your typical sort of backyard swimming pool. A single drop dissolved in that entire volume of water, the shark would be able to detect the difference between that and a pristine swimming pool. All right. And so when you take that sort of concentration and you diffuse it over an area, a single drop over what's maybe a 20 by 30 foot area or something like that, that's the sort of area that we're talking about that these sharks would be able to detect and recognize that's a single drop. Seldom do we ever bleed 1 drop. If you're going to get cut, it's going to be more than that. And so it's necessarily going to scale with the volume of the stimulant, the blood in this case. So think of it as, diffusing over an area And going down to 1 part per billion, it's a tiny fraction of what's actually what that the sharks are able to actually detect. And it's amazing. It really is cool. And when they say that sharks are super smellers and they're basically swimming noses, yeah, it's not wrong. They do have a very good sense of smell. But the other fact that I'd like to throw in there is that other fishes are also able to detect at very, very low concentrations. So it's not necessarily that sharks are the best. They're really good. But there's other things. Catfish are even better. They can detect even lower concentrations than sharks when it comes to odors. And so sharks are great. They're better than a lot, but they're certainly not the best when it comes to the absolute lowest concentration that can be detected.
Right on. So some of the things we see, and there's a lot of people out there that are certainly have shark phobia, and they worry and they say, "Well, I'm going to wear this special bracelet to ward off the sharks." Does it actually work?
What I tell people is, if it makes you happy, go ahead. What answer do you want from me? Do you want me to say yes, it works? Fine, I'll tell you that. Do you want me to say no, it doesn't work? I'll tell you that too. Basically, what it does, we're probably talking about these little magnet bracelets that are commercially available. And the idea is that these magnets basically overwhelm the shark's electromagnetic sense. And as a result, these sharks are coming in, they detect this, and they veer away. And they're startled by it and go away from the swimmer. Okay? That's the concept behind it. Does it work? In the scientific literature, they have tested several different shark deterrents, including those little magnet bracelets, and the magnet bracelets did not have any significant deterrent effect on the sharks. Okay, so probably not for the most part. But if it makes you feel better, if it gets people in the water and it makes them more engaged with the environment, I would say if it makes you feel better, then do it. You're not going to affect anything. You're not going to attract them, right? You might repel them if they get really close, but honestly, it's not going to do anything one way or the other. So if it makes you feel better, by all means, wear it. You'll feel better and happier in the water. And I think that's really what it's all about. It's getting people out there enjoying the natural environment and, using whatever makes them happy, allows them to go out and enjoy the world around them.
Absolutely. So I guess we should dispel the myth. Are all sharks apex predators?
Oh, so that's another term that gets bandied around a lot. People say apex predators, top of the food chain. The problem is apex predator really means that the very tippy top of the pyramid, let's say. All right. There's a lot of things that are underneath that, and there's very few sharks that are actually apex predators. Right. Even the big migrations of blacktip sharks that I studied down here in South Florida. We have these sharks that are about 2 meters long, about 6 feet, right? And they are cruising right along the beach where the people are, and people are concerned about them. And rightly so, the sharks are right there. But those sharks are not apex predators. They're taken out by even bigger sharks, by the big bull sharks, the big hammerhead sharks, other larger, even larger predators. And so when we say apex predators, we mean the tippy top of the food chain, the ones where no one else eats you. But most sharks are eaten by something bigger, usually a bigger shark. And the vast majority of sharks are not particularly big. When you think of all the different shark species out there, the hundreds of different species, the majority of them are less than a meter long, less than 3 feet long, right? They're little things for the most part. And so they are taken out by bigger fish and bigger sharks. So very few sharks are actually what you would call apex predators, the tippy top of the food chain. Most of them are below that by 1 or 2 levels.
So that brings up an interesting question. There's all these sharks out there. How many different varieties of sharks can we actually attribute bites or deaths to?
Yeah, if you look at something like the International Shark Attack File, which is collated by the University of Florida up in Gainesville, they've been collecting shark bite information for decades now. They have the most extensive database of all these shark bites. And what they are finding is that there are a handful of sharks that are responsible for the greatest number of bites on people. And it might be a little surprising. The greatest number of bites are not by the big white sharks or the bull sharks or something. They're by blacktip sharks. Blacktips are the ones that are migrating close to the beach, right along the shoreline, right where the people are. And so as a result, you've got the people in the water, you've got the sharks migrating past them. Necessarily, you're going to have a lot of interaction between the sharks and people. Now, these are not fatal bites. That's the big difference, right? Mm-hmm. When a blacktip bites you, yes, it's going to be a nasty wound on your hand or your foot or something, but you're not going to lose your life. Right. So there are shark bites. Blacktips responsible for like a third or more of all shark bites worldwide. And then you've got fatalities. Fatalities are different. That's when you're getting the big sharks doing things like, extensive tissue damage where the person is bleeding out. And that's where you can attribute it to the big white sharks, the big tiger sharks, the big bull sharks. Those are your big three when it comes to fatal bites. When it comes to just plain bites, heck, I mean, people get bitten by like little nurse sharks all the time because they go and say, oh, it's harmless, I'll go pull on its tail. And then they go ahead and get bitten. I mean, I don't even call that a bite. You brought that on yourself. There's really no excuse for that sort of action.
So pulling on the shark's tail, not a good idea then.
Generally not.
I didn't know we had to say that, but okay. I always thought sticking your head in the lion's mouth seemed like a bad idea too, but maybe that's just me. So there's a misconception out there. Do all sharks actually need to keep moving in order to breathe and live?
Yeah, that's another idea that's been out there for a long time. And the reality is that applies to a lot of species, but not all of them. Some sharks are able to sit on the bottom and what's called buccal pump. They open their mouth and they draw water in through their mouth and pump it over the gills. So they're able to sit on the seafloor and just pump like this and breathe just fine. And it's a perfectly natural behavior. And you see it not just in things like, nurse sharks that people are familiar with from diving in the Caribbean and stuff, but other species, lemon sharks will do the same thing. Here's a shark that people think is a requiem shark, a shark that's constantly swimming, but it will go and park itself on the bottom and sit there and it'll buccal pump just fine. You'll see this with even some other species. It was documented with I think it's Caribbean reef sharks down in Mexico back in the 1970s. Eugenie Clark saw this population of Caribbean reef sharks that were just basically parked in a cave, sitting there, not even moving, just buccal pumping and respiring. So even sharks that look like sleek swimmers can, on occasion, just sit there and park and, still draw enough water over their gills to keep themselves aerated and doing just fine. And it's interesting that a lot of species are obligate ram ventilators, like all the hammerheads, for example. You can't stop them. They have to swim. Like from the moment that they're born until they die, they never stop moving. They always have to keep swimming to move the water over their gills. But that's maybe a lot of the sharks, but it's certainly not all of them. And especially when you consider some of the little reef sharks, little cat sharks and things that will sit on a reef and tuck up underneath a coral head, go down to the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. You'll see these sharks tucked up underneath the little coral heads and just sitting there pumping away, doing just fine all by themselves. And so the number of sharks that actually has to swim to breathe is maybe half or so. Certainly not all of the species.
Right on. So more myths. Can sharks get cancer?
So this is an interesting story that goes back to, I guess, maybe the mid 1980s or so. It was based on a book called Sharks Don't Get Cancer, or something to that effect. And that was the title of the book. And basically the premise was sharks don't get cancer. Their skeletons are made of cartilage. Maybe if we eat cartilage, we won't get cancer either. And so it was not very well thought out in terms of the logic. But it was based on some work that was out of Mote Marine Lab in Sarasota, Florida, and Carl Luer's lab. And Dr. Luer had looked at injecting various carcinogens in sharks and found them to be very robust. It was hard to get them to get the sharks to generate cancerous growths. Now, that being said, they do it, and they are perfectly capable of getting cancer. And we've seen that both in wild populations of sharks. We've seen examples of sharks with cancerous growths, as well as induced in the lab. But they seem to be very robust. They seem to have a good immune system that allows them to do remarkably well. And it's certainly an area that requires a lot more work, a lot more resources to pump at that. Because I think it's a really interesting question. But it's a myth. They don't get cancer. Yeah, they do, but maybe not quite at the same rate as some others. Why? It's not simply because their skeleton is made of cartilage. So it's not eat shark cartilage, it'll cure you or make you immune. No, that's not going to help. And I think here's where I think the tragedy lies, is that some people who actually do have cancer and they're looking for anything, right? They're looking for some cure. They're looking for hope, and they're relying on these stories, these false cures, and it's not helping them. You're not helping the people who are desperately in need of comfort and medical attention by giving them eat shark cartilage will be better. You're doing a disservice to people, and I think that's the biggest tragedy. In addition to harvesting sharks for no good reason, you're also it's almost cruel to the humans who are suckered in by this, and so I think that's the biggest tragedy here.
Sure. Is there a reason to harvest sharks truthfully?
There are a few artisanal shark fisheries where small communities will harvest them to eat and feed themselves. I don't know enough about it worldwide. I know that in developed countries like North America, there's no good reason. We don't need to do it at all. But I know that in some developing countries, perhaps that's one of the few sources of fish protein that they can get. And maybe for them, that is a reasonable exploitation. But when you consider that level of exploitation is so small, minuscule, compared to the grand scheme of world fisheries, it's our small artisanal fisheries are not that big a deal when it comes to shark populations. It's the big commercial long-line fisheries out there. That's where the real damage is happening to shark populations.
Right on. So kind of to resume our fact or fiction, if you see a shark in the water, what should you do?
It depends what you're doing at the time. If you're out there snorkeling around and you get to see a shark, that's great. I would enjoy it, and say, wow, this is a great opportunity to see one of these animals up close and in the wild. The same thing if you're diving, right? If you're on the reef somewhere diving and see a shark, just take a minute to really enjoy it and say, this is a fantastic opportunity. There are times when you don't want to do that. If you are, maybe someone's fishing nearby, right? And they've got some bait in the water and, reeling in fish, and the sharks are coming in after them and hitting the fish. Not a good time to be in the water. The sharks are agitated. They're looking for food at that point. And if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, the shiny palm of your hand catching the light could look like a little shiny fish or something, and you could get nailed. So in that sort of scenario, someone's fishing on the beach, lots of sharks agitated, go swimming somewhere else. But for the most part, if you get an opportunity to see it, enjoy it. I mean, it's so rare to be able to see these things up close in the wild. They're usually pretty skittish. They usually stay away from you. So if you can see them, by all means, take advantage and say, wow, this is great.
So do sharks have a place on our reefs?
Yeah, for sure. Sharks definitely have a place on our reefs and the entire ecosystem. Remember that the sharks were here long before humans came along. And sharks have been doing what they've been doing for literally hundreds of millions of years. And excuse me, the ecosystem has been developed to the point where sharks have formed this integral part of it. And to remove them is to remove an important part in this link, this chain. You remove the sharks, you reduce the population, you weaken the link, you weaken that whole chain, and you have the potential for catastrophic events. So for example, if you had a top level predator, all right, and it keeps in check the next level predators, and they keep in check the next level producers, right? And if you remove those sharks, maybe you have no control over the population of little prey fish, and they expand, and they eat all the little tiny fish. And as a result, the algae grows out of control, all right? And it smothers the coral, right? And so, having reducing one thing in the food chain could have cascading effects through multiple levels. It's not just the sharks. They keep in check the next level, which keeps in check the next level and the next level, et cetera. And so doing something to remove the sharks could have this large effect down the road on other parts of the food chain. And I think that's an important factor for people to consider.
So my favorite study on that is the wolves in Yellowstone, and I'm sure you've got to be familiar with that study. But it seems like you're talking the same thing. We removed one of these high-level predators from Yellowstone, and it literally changed the direction of the rivers.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's and part of the problem is we can't predict. We can't say if we do this, then that's going to happen. The ocean, the entire marine ecosystem is way too complex for us to model it simply, like this, 1, 2, 3. We had no idea that the wolves would actually redirect water flow, right? I mean, who could have predicted that in advance? Mm-hmm. But that's the end result. And so that's one of the concerns with having something like this, where you are reducing the numbers of sharks. You don't know what's going to happen, what the downstream effects might be. And so that's one of the factors that we have to consider. And I would err on the side of caution and say, you know what, let's try and maintain the ecosystem as close as possible to its pristine state. It's been doing fine for millions of years. Let's do that and minimize our impact rather than saying, well, let's try this. And, I don't think much will happen. Yeah, maybe it will. Maybe it just might.
What's the question you wish people would ask more about when it comes to sharks?
I wish people would be more interested in some of the less charismatic species, right? When you think of sharks, you think of the typical sort of, when I say shark, people immediately picture like a white shark or like a big bull shark or something, right? These big top level predators. But there's lots of other sharks out there that I think are equally interesting. They're just not the big charismatic ones that get all the attention. And in fact, the vast majority of sharks are, like I said, little things that live, deep underwater. People don't really know that they exist, but there's, dozens of species of these deep water atmopteran sharks, lantern sharks. They glow in the dark. I think that's fascinating. I think that's really cool. And the individual color patterns, the glowing patterns on the side are unique to each species. And so these sharks way down in the deep water where they can't really see each other per se, they can see the bioluminescent glow of their partners, and they can recognize, oh, that's the same species as me. Maybe we'll go mate. Or maybe that's a different species. I'll stay away from that one, right? Stuff like this, it doesn't get the attention. And there are, like I said, dozens and dozens of cool species that people are largely unaware of, unfamiliar with. And I think if people knew more about some of these more bizarre sharks, they might have a renewed appreciation, a deeper appreciation for the variety of different species that are out there and the variety of different lifestyles and habitats that these sharks inhabit, and generate additional interest. And I think that would be something I would like to see, is more interest in the lesser known sharks, because that's just really got to capture people's attention.
The lantern shark seems to be making an interesting round. I've heard more and more about that recently. What's another shark that we don't know about that you think is extremely interesting that we should know about?
There's another one that I think is really cool. And there's a couple. I mean, how do I choose just one? But one of my favorite sharks, one of the sharks that I have to see before I die, is the winghead shark. This is a hammerhead shark that has the biggest head of any shark. All right, it's like a T. It's like the width of the head can be half the length of the body. So if you have a body that's a meter long, your head is 50 centimeters wide. It's enormous. And this animal is found from North Australia up through Indonesia, up to maybe India or so. And it's not a big shark, less than 2 meters long, so not huge. And they are just so bizarre because the head is like a hammerhead on steroids. It's just gone nuts. It's just gone so huge. And that is a really interesting specimen from an evolutionary perspective. Why did it get that big? There's no need for the head to be that big. And how does it swim? How does it mate? How do you manage to grab your partner if your head is that big? Both your heads are that big. How are they born? I mean, it's got to be quite the experience for mom. And all these sorts of cool questions. What does it see with its eyes way off on the ends of the head? What does it smell with this enormous nose? Like about a third or 2/3 of its head is nose, right? That is a fascinating shark, but it's just simply unstudied because it's difficult to get. It's in an inaccessible location. There's not a lot of marine labs in Southeast Asia that really have that sort of capacity to go and fish the sharks, bring them back to the lab and do these experiments. And so I think that is one of the sharks that I think is one of the most interesting and unstudied. We know it's out there. We've got museum specimens. We just don't have them, in captivity to examine. So that's one that I think people would be really excited about if we actually got some footage of that shark.
Wow, that is actually pretty amazing. So how about along those same lines, are there any freshwater sharks out there?
Yeah. And in fact, there's, in the same area in Northern Australia, for example, you've got these river sharks that are able to go well up into the rivers and, live in fresh water. You've got a couple of different species in that area, Southeast Asia and Northern Australia, that are able to do that. And this is another cool thing. There's also populations of stingrays that are exclusive to the Amazon basin, where they live their whole lives totally in freshwater, the freshwater Amazonian stingrays. And again, they have these special adaptations to enable them to live and function perfectly well in fresh water. It's so interesting. Evolution, it takes what you've got and it sort of cobbles it together to come up with a solution, right? These things are designed to live in salt water. And so they've had to come up with adaptations to enable them to live in freshwater. And they're not necessarily the most efficient adaptations, but they work. It's, evolution works by not perfect, but by good enough. And as a result, these sharks are rays are able to do, good enough and do well enough in freshwater that they're perfectly functional. And so you've got these animals, sharks, rays that are living in freshwater, and some like the bull sharks. People are probably very familiar with the bull sharks, typically a marine species, but the females will often go upstream into rivers, give birth to their pups in freshwater rivers, and the pups will stay there for, a year or so and grow up and then eventually move downstream and join the adult population in the ocean. And so these sharks are able to go through this range of salinities from full-strength seawater up to freshwater, back to full-strength seawater again, and I think that sort of dynamic range is particularly interesting as well. There's a lot of, physiological adaptations that they have to do in their body to enable them to go through this dramatic change in the environment. And again, cool stuff out there. And the more people know, I think the more excited they'll be, the more they'll say, wow, sharks are really interesting. It's not just the big ones. There's lots of other stuff out there that's doing, some cool different behaviors.
I think you bring up an interesting point on that as well, because you talked a little bit about rays. Rays and sharks are related.
Yeah. So they're all part of the same group, the elasmobranch fishes, sharks and rays, sharks and their relatives. And they're you can think of basically a shark or maybe a stingray as taking a shark and running a steamroller over it and flattening it out. And now it's all squished out flat. The internal anatomy is the same. Everything is there. It's just like now it's a 2D pancake instead of like a 3D tube. basically. And that's really what it boils down to. But all the same sensory systems are there, all the same physiological mechanisms are there. And so we can often use stingrays as a great proxy to study sharks. And one of the nice things about stingrays is that they're easier to maintain in tanks, right? They're not constantly swimming around. They don't need necessarily a big area. Stingrays sit on the bottom for the most part, so you're able to keep several stingrays together in the tank and do your experiments on them and whatever you need to do, and you can keep them in a much smaller space than you would need if you had a big shark that had to swim around, for example. So they're a great study species or group. And since they are so closely related, what you find in the stingray is directly applicable to what you find in the sharks as well.
That's amazing. So you touch on something that's really interesting for me, at least, is you start talking about sensory biology in sharks. What exactly is this? Help me understand that.
Sure. So my training is actually as a sensory physiologist. I look at how the shark perceives the world. And so think of yourself, think of a typical human, right? We have our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, our touch on our fingers. These are the primary mechanisms by which we interact with the environment. We see, we hear, we smell, we taste, we touch, right? That's basically how we gather information about our environment. And that's what we're interested in, how the sharks process their environment, how they gather information. They have the same things, eyes and nose and mouth, ears, they have all those same things as well. But they also have a couple other things. They have a lateral line sense, something that runs along the side of the body. You can see this in not just sharks, but other fish. You look at any sort of fish, you see a nice line along the side of the body. That's the lateral line. And that enables them to detect water motion. And so you don't have to touch someone. You don't have to touch the fish. You can just move the water, and that water movement translates to the side of the body, and the shark's able to detect that. Okay, and says, I can feel this fish swimming beside me. I mean, maybe it's totally dark. You can't see it. You can't smell it. No other sensory cues. But the shark can detect the movement of the water with its lateral line system. Okay, so that's an extra sensory system that we don't have. Right? There's another sensory system that sharks have that we don't. It's their electrosense. It's how they detect electric fields in the environment. And if you think of it this way, all living organisms maintain a concentration of chemicals inside their body, and it's typically different than the seawater around them. Okay, and so a little fish is maintaining a concentration of ions in the body that's not quite the same as the surrounding seawater. And so as a result, that little fish is basically a battery. It has this charge, this concentration of ions that's not the same, and that ionic concentration can leak out through things like the gills or through the mouth. And as a result, it sets up an electric field, a charge in space, in the water around that animal. And so the sharks have evolved to detect these weak, naturally occurring bioelectric fields around their prey items. And so if you take a little fish, and so let's say it buries under the sand, right? So you can't see it, can't smell it, doesn't make any noise, can't touch it. All these other cues are knocked out. But the fact that it is still there and maintaining its chemical concentration different than the water means that it's creating a little electrical charge around its body. And the shark is able to detect that electrical charge, dig up that fish, and consume it, even though the fish was not producing any other cues. Another fish that doesn't have electroreceptors would swim right over it, wouldn't know it was there. But this shark, with its electroreceptors, is able to detect that prey item and say, there's something hidden there, and it can precisely locate it and consume it. And I think that's one of the coolest senses that they have. Vision, touch, taste. We have all of those. We're familiar with those. But this is a whole different system, a whole different way of getting information about the environment that we are simply unaware of. And, the cool thing is we only discovered it 50 years ago in the late 1960s. And I tell my students, it's like we discovered vision for the first time only 50 years ago, right? Think of all the things that you could look at. Think of all the things that you could discover if you have a whole new sensory system, right? That's where we are. That's where we are with the electrosense. We've discovered this whole new way that these animals are able to detect the world. Think of all the cool questions we can ask with that.
That is really interesting. So we live on planet water, as I jokingly teach in my open water classes. I mean, we're 2/3 water, 1/3 dirt. So we're on planet water. Planet is how I term it. Ocean's a pretty big place. How do they use this sensory perception to find each other for mating and for travel?
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of different factors. One is they can use their electrosense specifically to find prey, and it's a very close range sense because electric fields, they ground out in seawater very rapidly, right? Mm-hmm. And so the electric fields don't propagate very far away. You're talking like a meter at the most for a natural electric field, right? I mean, we can make them bigger if we stick 200 volts in the ocean, but we're not going to do that. Talk about natural bioelectric fields that an animal would produce are very close range senses. So the shark needs to be fairly close before it's going to be able to use its electrosense to detect it. But there was some cool work with an old colleague of mine who looked at stingray mating, and he found that male stingrays, are able to detect females that are buried under the sand in much the same way that they would detect like a buried prey item. And the males are able to detect the female stingrays and come over and attempt to mate with them that way. And so they're clearly using their electrosense in that case to mate with the females. And the reason they were able to say that definitively was because they didn't even have females in the water. They just put a pair of electrodes in the water that mimicked the electric field of a female stingray. And sure enough, the male came over to those electrodes and was trying to bite at them, trying to mate with the model. And so it's clearly using the electric cue only as a way to locate a potential mate. And the other factor, so not only for mating, but the other factor that the electrosense comes into play is with navigation. So we have on this planet, we have the North Pole and the South Pole, right? You get this big giant magnetic field that envelops the Earth. Well, electric fields and magnetic fields are closely intertwined. They're basically, think of them as operating at right angles to each other, right? So you got an electric field this way, your magnetic field is going to go this way. And so one of the ideas has been proposed is that sharks might be able to use the Earth's magnetic field to allow them to navigate. They know which way is north and south and east and west just based on swimming through the magnetic field. If you have a magnetic field and you swim through it, you are going to do what's called induction. You're going to induce an electric field. It's called electromagnetic induction. What I tell my students is if you take your phone and you put it on your charger, you don't have to touch it, you don't have to plug it in, but just the fact that it's sitting there, there's an electromagnetic induction that charges your phone. A shark swimming through the Earth's magnetic field could create an electric field around itself that it can detect with its electroreceptors. And so as it's swimming east, I'm facing east right now. As it's swimming east, it would produce this electric field around its body. And then as it turns north, that would get smaller and smaller and smaller because you're running parallel with the Earth's magnetic field. And then as you turn west, the magnetic field would get bigger and bigger, but to go in the opposite direction. And so the shark could gather some directional information just based on swimming through the Earth's magnetic field. And that's one of the coolest things that they can do is navigate just with the Earth's magnetic field using their electroreceptors. And again, the electroreceptors, navigation potentially, finding mates definitely, and finding food. That's one of the primary reasons that they have it. And so a sense that's very newly discovered, poorly studied, not a lot of work has been done on it, and I think is to me the most interesting of all the ways of perceiving the world, because it's something that we don't have. We can only imagine how they perceive the world with their electrosense.
That is interesting. So you study blacktip sharks, and they have a fairly robust migratory cycle. Are they using the same electromagnetic sense of the North Pole, South Pole, and then determining how far to go each direction based upon what the kind of environment they like to be in?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the short answer is I don't know. I wish I had a definitive answer for you, and so. With these blacktips, one of the confounding factors is they are migrating right along the coast. They're basically hugging the shoreline as they migrate from South Florida all the way up to Long Island, New York in the summertime. And then in the fall, as temperatures cool, they migrate back down south again. And whether they're using their electrosense, their electromagnetic induction to navigate, or whether they're just staying, in water that's 10 feet deep all the way up the coast, and that keeps them close to the shore, that's a confounding factor. They might simply be staying close to the beach, and that's the simpler explanation, rather than relying on electromagnetic induction to help them navigate. But certainly with other species, look at things like mako sharks. Here you've got these sharks that are out there in the open ocean, far from any sort of other cues. They're in the middle of nowhere. It's all blue water around them. There's no other input other than a magnetic compass to help keep them on course. And you see these beautiful straight line tracks, dot after dot, just lined up in a perfect straight line, indicating these sharks are making these long distance migrations while still maintaining this perfectly straight track. And that really speaks to this sort of use of electromagnetic induction to help them navigate with respect to the Earth's north and south poles.
That is extremely interesting. So you're a mako shark and you have no visual clues. There's the ocean temperature is going to be fairly consistent, I would imagine, at the point that they stay. How do they find each other to mate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the explanations is that they've been doing this a long time. They know where to go and when to find their partners. And they also have probably a very good sense of smell. And so, yes, it's open ocean, but a female might be producing sufficient pheromonal cues that the male might be able to pick up on and swim and say, oh, I smell something. Maybe I'll swim upstream and up current and see where the source of that odor is and find their mates in that way. So I'm sure it's largely a case of over time these animals know where to go and when to meet their partners, and then other cues like odor probably come into play to enable them to get close enough to actually mate.
That's extremely interesting. So you're studying blacktip sharks. What's the most interesting thing you've learned in your study of blacktip sharks and their annual migration?
Yeah, so we started looking at this migration over a dozen years ago now. And, at the time, it was suggested that these blacktip sharks come down to South Florida in the wintertime, and then they go up to maybe about Cape Hatteras, North Carolina by the summertime. And then, females will give birth and mating takes place and they mill around up there. And then in the fall, they move back down again. We thought that would be the case. But when we started instrumenting them with transmitters, we found out that they are not stopping at North Carolina. They are going, double the distance. They're going way up there, all the way up to like Long Island, New York. We get blacktips off Montauk, off the the east coast of Long Island there. And so these sharks are going much farther than we ever thought they went before. And what's interesting is they seem to be following this temperature. And so if you look at the temperatures that these sharks are inhabiting, they have this temperature band from around 23 to 25 Celsius where they're found. And then down here in the wintertime, the water temperature is 23 to 25 or so. And then in the spring, it starts to get warmer here, and that same temperature is found at higher and higher and higher latitudes. And so that's where the sharks are going. And that same temperature is found all the way off New York in the summertime, and the sharks are going way up there. And then as it starts to cool, that temperature is found at lower and lower latitudes, closer and closer down to Florida, and the sharks are basically following their preferred temperature up and down the coast. And so temperature is the simplest, the lowest common denominator. There may be other things like bait fish. Bait fish may be following that same temperature up and down the coast, and the sharks are subsequently following the bait fish, right? But temperature is probably the primary driver, which helps these sharks to make these migrations up and down the coast. And these other things like photoperiod, the length of day. As the days become shorter and shorter in the fall, sharks are able to use that cue and say, oh, days are getting shorter. I better start heading south. It's going to get real cold real soon, right? And so they're using other cues, environmental cues, to help them make these migrations as well. And I think that's cool that these same sharks that are here in South Florida are going all the way up and all the way back. Previously we knew that sharks went a little ways up. We didn't know they went that far. I mean, the blacktips in particular. We didn't know the blacktips went that far up to New York and back. And we found, some blacktips were, farther north, but we didn't know that those were the ones that came from all the way down here in South Florida. So it's not like little subpopulations moving a little bit. It's a population that's moving all the way along the coast, not just moving a little bit, but a huge distance back and forth along the coast every year. That's a much bigger migration than we ever imagined before. And I think part of that is attributable to global climate change. As the oceans have warmed, we have seen these sharks going to higher latitudes because the oceans are warmer now. They're at their preferred temperature is being found at higher and higher latitudes now than it ever was before. And so I think there's this interesting and strong correlation between water temperature and shark abundance. They like that temperature and they move back and forth with it. And as the oceans have warmed and shifted, sharks have shifted their distribution in response to that as well.
So it sounds like climate change is absolutely changing the migration habits of the sharks as well.
Yeah, and it's not just with these blacktips that I've looked at. This has been documented with other sharks, tiger sharks, bull sharks. Other species have demonstrated these latitudinal shifts in distribution in response to changing water temperature. So again, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, these cascading effects of the ecosystem. We don't know what that's going to mean. If we don't have the sharks down here because the water is too warm in South Florida, right? What's that going to mean for the populations of other fish that they would typically feed on, right? Maybe they're going to explode. Maybe they're going to, take out all the invertebrates or whatever, and have this explosion of seagrass and stifle the reefs. Who knows, right? And so there are these effects that may not be direct, but are indirect effects that could have huge impacts on the ecosystem for something like global warming. It's not simply a matter of changing the distribution. Yeah, that's a big impact, but it also impacts whoever's left down here, or it impacts other species where these sharks are not typically found off New York, and now they are. And now what are they going to do when you have thousands of blacktip sharks off Long Island? You're going to impact that ecosystem. And in fact, in the past year or so, we've seen a huge increase in the number of bites on humans off the south shore of Long Island, simply because we're getting more and more sharks migrating up there now, which historically we've never had in those sorts of numbers close to the beach. And so, it's not a simple matter of, oh, well, the sharks are, moving. Yeah, they're moving, but there's a lot of other factors that come into play that we need to be aware of as well.
That's really interesting. So similarly, as humans get involved in things, a lot of times that's not always the greatest thing for an ecology, right? It's oftentimes better we just keep our big nose out and let them do their thing would be a lot easier, but then we don't learn anything either. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on these? In your area, there's a lot of companies out there that do these shark dives where they bait the sharks in, they feed them in one way or the other. What are your thoughts on shark dives that involve baiting and attracting sharks in? How does that affect their behavior as well? Sure.
So it's interesting. In the state of Florida, you're not allowed to do any of these sort of shark dives within state waters. You have to be outside on my coast, it's a 3-mile limit on the outside. And so none of these operations take place close to the beach. And the idea is you don't want to do it close to the beach, baiting in sharks and bringing them close to where the swimmers are, for example, right? I can understand that. That's fine. And in terms of altering the behavior of these animals, it's one of those things where I wish I had a definitive answer for you, because on the one hand, you are clearly seeing the same individuals coming back time and time again to these beta stations. They become accustomed to it, and they come back for the little scraps and whatever they can get. And so in that instance, yeah, clearly you are influencing the behavior of these animals to a certain extent. But I don't have data, so I'm just going to give you my opinion on this.
Fair enough.
The sharks are not relying on that. The sharks are still out there foraging naturally and feeding naturally. They're still doing everything. They're not getting nearly enough little scraps to live on. And so in that sense, you're not altering their natural foraging behavior. They're still out there feeding on the reef. They're still out there foraging like normal. So I don't think that these operations are having a long-term detrimental impact to the animals. All right. I'm more concerned that they are run well and safely for the safety of the humans who are jumping in the water. Some of the operations are very well controlled and very safely done. Others are not. And those are the ones I'm more concerned about, because it's almost a free-for-all down there. And when the sharks get too excited and start zipping around, that's when accidents can happen. If it's a careful, controlled release of the stimulus, it's more controlled, and it's safer for the people. And I think that's the bigger concern. The sharks will come in, they'll take advantage, but I don't think we're going to be changing their behavior so much so that they become reliant on humans, or that they become accustomed to humans in that sense. I think the concern is more about how safely the operations are designed for the divers.
That's awesome. So now we're creating fat ducks that can't swim, fly south for the winter. It's always the worry. Got to get those ducks to fly south. They make a lot of mess. We're good. You're definitely heading into the end of our time here, but can you talk about any ongoing and future research projects you have planned regarding the shark behavior and sensory biology?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've been doing is looking at how well the sharks hear. This is something that was examined a lot in the 1960s and early 70s. And people have said, oh, sharks have a great sense of hearing. They can hear from huge distances and orient. And it's the same sort of mentality that we've had with the shark smelling. Sharks are super smellers. They can smell from a mile away, that sort of thing. There's very little data to support that. And so we're trying to address that with something else, with shark hearing now. We're testing this by putting an underwater speaker in the environment, and we're producing these pulsed underwater tones. And the nice thing is we have access to a way to measure this now. You can have drones, a little aerial drone that flies overhead and looks down. And now you can see the speaker, you can see the sharks around, and you can actually measure from how far away do the sharks turn and initiate their turn toward that speaker, or their turn away from it. Before, we had to rely on estimates. People up on the top of the boat saying, oh, I see one over there, and it turned toward it or something, right? Great, fine, but that was the 60s, right? We've got so much more technology now. We can actually definitively measure the distance at which these sharks are orienting. And so I think that's a cool project that is being revisited now after 40, 50 years, that enables us to get better data to see exactly what these sharks are able to detect. And in terms of the other migratory information, we've been looking at these black tips for a long time now, and we have great information as to where these black tips are going, but we want to start expanding that. What are the predators doing? We're interested in looking at the hammerheads, these great hammerheads who come in and eat these black tips. And we've got some great drone footage of, black tips are maybe, like what I said, like 5-6 feet long. The hammerheads are double that, 12-foot hammerheads are coming in and eating these black tips. If the black tips are migrating, what are the hammerheads doing? Do they follow them? Or do they just sort of stay down here and wait for the black tips to come down again next year? I don't know. We're going to find out. So we're starting to put satellite transmitters on not only the black tips, but also their predators, the hammerheads as well, to see what they're doing. Where are they going? How are they responding? And I think that's going to be a really interesting piece of information to piece together more of what's happening in this local ecosystem. The black tips are not the apex predators, the hammerheads are. And so we know what the black tips are doing. Let's move it up a step. Let's see what the apex predators are doing. Let's see what the big hammerheads are doing to those black tips. And stay tuned. I mean, hopefully we get out fishing next week and put some more tags on them and have some more data for you. Maybe we'll do this again in next year or something. I'll be able to give you an answer.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the interesting things that I've heard you say twice now, that I don't think most of us think of hammerheads as being in the apex level of being one that eats other sharks. I think we thought of those as kind of the cool things they certainly eat things and smaller things, but not black tips or anything like that.
It's so interesting. We have this footage. We've seen it several times now, where you have these black tips sort of massing in shallow water right up against the beach, and the hammerheads will come in and chase them right up onto the beach. And the hammerheads are so much bigger that they can't get a shell. They have to turn around and go back. If they don't get the black tip, the hammerhead has to go back into deeper water. The black tip is smaller, can get even shallower, almost beach itself before getting back into the water. So the black tips are really using the shallows as like a refuge, to a safe place to get out of the way of these bigger predatory hammerhead sharks. But when the hammerheads are successful, it's amazing. I mean, I tell my students, I'm 5'9". I'm about the same size as these black tips. And these hammerheads are taking these black tips down head first, just the whole thing. All you see is a little bit of tail sticking out of the mouth. I said, yeah, these are big hammerheads. And so if they're taking down a shark the same size as me, yeah, just something to keep in mind.
That is absolutely something to keep in mind for sure. Wow, I have learned a lot. So what advice would you give somebody that's interested in following you in a career in shark biology and research?
If you want to do it, I encourage you to do whatever you want to do, whatever makes you happy. I was really fortunate that I was able to do what I wanted to do since birth, and do well in your classes. Do well not only in your science classes, but English. You have to be able to write and to communicate effectively. And a lot of students are, so focused on their biology and their chemistry and things. That's great, but you need to be able to communicate. Your results are not done, or you're not done with your experiment until you disseminate your results to the public, so everyone knows what you've done. That's the last step, and that's what you need to be able to write well and get that information out there.
It's great advice, absolutely, for anybody going into just about any, to be able to communicate with others. Well, let's leave off with, what are the most pressing challenges facing shark populations today?
I think we've seen a shift. We used to have this concern about sharks being harvested primarily for their fins in the shark fin soup industry in Asia, but fortunately that's shifted away a lot, and there's been a lot of public pressure against shark fin soup, and you don't see that as big as a driver. But they're still harvesting large numbers of sharks for meat, and not just human meat. I mean, like cat food and things like that. And it's a terrible waste of these upper trophic level predators to be ground up to be fed to your kitty cats. I like cats, but there's better things to feed them than sharks. And so I think the sharks for meat is the next big thing that we need to tackle, and say, listen, there are other resources out there that are better. Let's start exploiting those rather than exploiting the sharks. Sharks take so long to mature, so long to reproduce, only have a small number of offspring. We can't harvest them at the same rate that you can harvest like a tuna, right? Tunas, they grow really fast. They have millions of eggs. They're huge numbers of offspring. Sharks, the opposite extreme. And so you can't harvest them at the same rate and expect it to be sustainable. Tunas, you can harvest them at a higher rate. They're going to be fine. Sharks, you have to harvest them at a much lower rate. And so let's shift our attention to something else. And I think that's going to be the next big challenge, is getting away from sharks as meat.
Right on. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today and going through and answering all my questions, no matter how outlandish they may have seemed. I appreciate it.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Awesome. Well, there you go, guys. Benjamin Hadfield, Teach Me to Dive, talking to Dr. Stephen Kajiura, amazing mentor and expert in shark ecology with Florida State Atlantic University. Decades and decades of research on this. From the time he could walk, he was studying sharks. So pretty amazing. And so thank you again for coming on.
Great. Thank you.